Approach the bench, Your Honor.
Yes, you may. Okay, let's get back on the record with a couple of items. We've had some discussion with respect to the proposed jury instruction, adding some additional language on page 8. Okay, and it would read with the last paragraph on page 8, second sentence. In considering the aggravated circumstances and the mitigating factors, understand that the aggravated murder itself is not an aggravating circumstance, and the nature and circumstances of the offense is not an aggravating circumstance, and can only be considered for mitigation. All right, on behalf of the state.
Yes, Chairman, I think that's a correct statement of the law, and then in consultation with the court and defense counsel agreed that that could be added.
All right, thank you. On behalf of the defendant.
Your Honor, that's correct. After discussion, I think that's acceptable.
Okay. Also, we had some discussion in the back. I just want to get it on the record, and then counsel can place anything on the record they deem appropriate. But the court has indicated to the parties that the court would allow cross-examination as it relates to prior adjudications and prior convictions. The court would not allow cross-examination as to underlying facts of prior adjudications and prior convictions. Court will allow cross-examination as it relates to incidents within the prison records and obviously any information that relates to mental health or psychological opinions or conclusions. All right. On behalf of the state, with respect to that statement.
Yes, Your Honor, I think that accurately reflects what we discussed, and the state's agreed not to ask about facts underlying adjudications in juvenile court or adult convictions, just the crime itself and the adjudication or conviction.
Okay. On behalf of the defendant?
That's correct, Your Honor. We're satisfied with that instruction.
Okay. All right. Are there any other matters that we need to place on the record at this time?
Not from the statement.
Judge, just what we talked about in the back in terms of the information that might come out from Dr. Stinson.
Regarding the fee.
Regarding?
The fee.
Oh, yes. Yeah, I've already had that conversation. When we get to the appropriate place, please let me know. Okay, and I will direct the camera gentleman.
This is not necessarily for Carla. Dr. Stinson has a PowerPoint, and we have it loaded if you want to try it before.
All right. Nope, not seeing anything.
Okay. Cool. Do you want to have a presentation?
Cool. That's fine.
Aha! Thank you.
Okay. All right. This item will be turned on. Okay. Yes. All rise for the jury. You may be seated, ladies and gentlemen. Again, thank you very much for your patience with us. At this time, we'll continue with the mitigation evidence on behalf of the defendant. You may call your next witness.
Thank you very much, Your Honor. At this time, I call to the stand Dr. Bob Stinson.
Good afternoon. Do you swear or affirm that the testimony that you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, as you shall answer unto God under the pains and penalties of perjury?
I do.
You may be seated. That is a mic, so I just ask that you please speak up loud enough so that the ladies and gentlemen of the jury can hear you.
Yes, sir.
Okay, for the record, if you please, state your name, spelling your last.
Sure. My name is Bob Stinson, and my last name is Stinson.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
All right, you may.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon, Dr. Stinson. How you doing?
Good afternoon. I'm good, thank you.
I would like to start out by first, would you give the members of a jury a little introduction of yourself and some of your qualifications, what you do for a living?
Sure. I'm a forensic psychologist, and I have a doctorate degree in psychology, having gone to Ohio State and gotten my undergraduate degree. And then I went to Wright State University School of Professional Psychology and obtained my doctorate degree. Thereafter, I got licensed and pursued board certification in forensic psychology.
And Dr. Stinson, did you also attend law school?
I did. I graduated with my doctorate in psychology in 1999, and then in 2007 I went back to law school, part-time in the evenings, graduating from law school in 2011.
Are you part of any professional affiliations? Do you member of any groups?
I am.
I don't have, do you have your resume with you, or would you like a copy?
I have a copy with me.
Can you give the members of the jury an idea of some of your professional affiliations?
Sure. I'm a member of the Central Ohio Psychological Association. I, in fact, am a past president of that association. I'm also a past president of the Ohio Psychological Association. I continue to serve on the ethics committee for the Ohio Psychological Association. I have previously chaired that committee. I'm currently the president-elect of the American Academy of Forensic Psychology, and I serve on the faculty of the American Board of Forensic Psychology, which is the board responsible for credentialing other board-certified forensic psychologists.
So I believe you indicated that you're part of some advisory boards and committees. Are you certified in sex offender treatment programming?
I'm not personally certified in sex offender treatment programming. However, I have served on the board in Ohio that credentials agencies and individuals who seek to become certified sex offender treatment programs in Ohio.
Dr. Stinson, do you know where Twin Valley Behavioral Hospital Center is?
I do.
And where's that located?
So Twin Valley Behavioral Health Care is at 2200 West Broad Street here in Columbus, in the Hilltop area of Columbus.
Did you ever serve in any capacity for Twin Valleys?
I worked in Twin Valley as a forensic psychologist for 15 years, from 1999 till 2014. There I was responsible for the services provided on one of the primary forensic units. I also served on and chaired the ethics committee at the hospital, and I supervised students, interns, and postdoctoral residents at the hospital.
Dr. Stinson, are you familiar with the Department of Youth Services?
I am.
Do you have any background, or were you ever employed by? Is that me?
It's you.
Stepping on that? Oh,
It's you.
let me move this back, just. I don't. I'll be looking around blaming everybody in the courtroom. It's me. I just keep looking at this table. What y'all doing? Getting back. So, did you serve at the Department of Youth Services?
I did. When I left Twin Valley in 2014, I actually took a position as Chief of Behavioral Health Services for the Ohio Department of Youth Services. the Ohio Department of Youth Services is the juvenile prison system in Ohio. And I stayed there for a little over 3 years, and then I left to go full-time private practice at that time.
And while at the Department of Youth Services, what were some of your responsibilities?
Well, a major responsibility was to kind of shore up the behavioral health system. At that point in time, the department had been under federal litigation for about 10 years in all different areas: behavioral health, education, their release authority, their medical care, dental care, education, just about every area. When I came on in 2014, the behavioral health had not been released from litigation. In other words, the federal courts and the individuals charged with monitoring the Ohio Department of Youth Services had continued to make claims that the behavioral health services were not meeting constitutional minimums. So I came on responsible in large part to get the behavioral health program in the state system to a point where it was providing not just constitutional minimums, but higher standards of care in behavioral health, so that not only could the department get out of federal litigation, but the separate institutions within the agency could be performing appropriate standards of care in behavioral health. Behavioral health includes psychology, psychiatry, and social work services.
Dr. Stinson, have you ever worked for any institutions? What I mean by that, penitentiaries or prison institutions. Have you ever served time working in any of those areas?
So I've never been officially employed by a correctional institution here in Ohio. I did training at London Correctional Institution when I was in graduate school. When I was chief of behavioral health services for the Ohio Department of Youth Services, one of the things I did is consulted with administrators from the Department of Rehabilitation and Corrections, the adult system, because they struggled to manage a lot of their youthful offenders. And they defined youthful offenders as individuals under the age of 25. And so as Chief of Behavioral Health Services for the Department of Youth Services, I served in a consultative role to them on managing that younger population.
Dr. Stinson, have you ever, talk about your court experience. Have you ever testified in court in Franklin County?
I have.
Any other counties?
Well, for 15 years, I worked at a state psychiatric hospital that sent us patients from all over the state of Ohio. So in that capacity, I've been in a number of counties testifying as to the evaluations I did at the hospital. I used to also work at a regional forensic center, which was responsible for doing court-ordered forensic evaluations from about 15 different counties in the state. So I obviously did evaluations and testified in a number of those counties. And even today in my private practice, although because I'm in Franklin County, I do most of my work in Franklin County, I really work around the state of Ohio and sometimes outside the state of Ohio. If I had to ballpark it, I would guess I've done evaluations in at least half the counties in the state of Ohio, maybe more. And I've testified in, I don't know, I would guess 20 different counties and also in federal court.
How many evaluations would you say that you actually testified to in court?
I don't keep track of that information, so I don't know with certainty. I would estimate that I've done a couple thousand evaluations, maybe more, in the last 20 years. If I testify in 5% of them, that would be a rough estimate, maybe 1 out of 20 evaluations I actually end up testifying in. Do the math, I guess is 100 or more times, maybe. I'm just ballparking, to be honest. I really don't know the answer. I'm just trying to calculate it based on the numbers over the years.
You ever testified in a capital case?
I have.
Do you have offhand how many capital cases that you've actually testified in?
I don't know how many I've testified in. I've consulted in capital cases both at the trial phase, like I am today, I've also consulted in what is referred to as post-conviction, so after the trial, during the appeals process, and even during the clemency process, when the parole board is making a determination of whether to recommend that the governor grant clemency. I've participated in those proceedings. I guess maybe all of those combined, I've been involved in maybe 30 or so cases. Again, just an estimate. And I haven't testified in all of them, maybe half of them. So maybe not even half, so maybe 10, 15 times perhaps.
Do you always work for the defense? Or do you work on or work for or retained by prosecutors also?
I don't work for any particular side. I do work for the defense. I do work for prosecutors' offices. I've done in civil litigation, I've done work for defense, I've done work for the plaintiff. The vast majority of the work that I've done over the course of my career has probably been for neither side necessarily. They're court ordered. So it's not like one side or the other is calling me. Rather, it's the court ordering an evaluation. Even today, in my private practice, I have contracts with courts in Franklin County, Delaware County, Richland County, and Marion County. So even today, most of the work I do is probably ordered by the courts. But to answer your question, I've done both capital cases and non-capital cases by request of both the defense and the prosecution.
Have you ever been declared an expert in any courts in Franklin County, Ohio?
I have.
Any other counties?
Yes, again, I don't know that I could name all of them, but certainly I think in every large county in Ohio. I've testified in Cuyahoga County, which is Cleveland, Franklin County, which is Columbus, down in Cincinnati, Akron, Toledo, and then a bunch of small counties throughout the state as well.
Judge, this time I'd like for Dr. Stinson to be declared an expert.
Any objection?
No, Your Honor.
The record shall so reflect.
Thank you. Dr. Stinson, were you asked by defense counsel in this case to do an evaluation in terms of our client, Anthony Barton?
Yes, I was.
And so jurors understand, what is a evaluation and what were you asked to do in this particular case?
Well, do you want me, I know we put together a presentation to kind of share the information. Do you want me to turn to that at this point in time? I don't have to, but I know that it's loaded up before we got started, so.
Would that be better? Would that help in the jury in understanding what you did in this case?
I think it does. They'll determine whether or not they find it helpful or not, but that was the reason that it was developed, is hopefully that it would be helpful to the jury.
Well, at this time, Your Honor, I'd ask that Dr. Stinson be allowed to show his presentation as far as the information in this particular case.
Can everyone see that okay? I mean, I'll dim the lights if necessary when we get to certain portions. Okay. Can you see it okay, Dr. Stinson?
I can, yes, thank you.
Dr. Stinson, I guess you'll start out. Your Honor, may I approach the witness for a minute?
You may.
That's just kind of an outline of the presentation, and then this is the answer.
Thank you, Dr. Stinson. So, Dr. Stinson, can all the members of the jury see this with that light, or would it help? Judge, could you dim it a little bit? Maybe it's just me. Can everybody, is that better?
Yeah.
Okay. Dr. Stinson, why don't you tell us, what are we looking at here?
Sure. This is just an outline of the presentation that I put together to try to share the information that I gathered over the course of my evaluation. So I had anticipated the question of, were you engaged in this case and what was your role? So that would be me describing how I conceptualized the purpose of my evaluation. And then moving on to talking about what I did over the course of my evaluation. In other words, the methods that I used in completing my evaluation. And then really getting into my findings. The third point is just a general overview of the mitigation findings that came out of my evaluation. Moving on to why are those mitigation findings important? What does the research tell us? What does the literature in the field of psychology tell us about those mitigating factors? And then applying them specifically to Tony Pardon's case. And then finally, drawing a link between the mitigation factors that have been identified through my evaluation and some of the negative outcomes that we will have seen in Tony's life.
Moving on to your next slide. Can you explain to the members of the jury what is presented in your next slide?
Sure. So this is just kind of identifying what the purpose of my evaluation is. I was asked to do what's referred to in my field as a psychological mitigation evaluation. And the easiest way to start to describe what a mitigation evaluation is I'm drawing from an article that was published in 2001 that essentially instructed psychologists in this field that this is what a mitigation evaluation should look like. In describing it, it's maybe easiest to understand if we compare it to what it's not. Obviously, we're no longer in the guilt phase of a trial. That case has been presented. You as a jury have decided on the issue of guilt. We're now in the sentencing phase of the trial. So my evaluation has nothing to do with addressing whether or not Tony Pardon's guilty of his offenses. In fact, by virtue of being here, he is. I know that he is. I know that you have found him guilty. My role is to address information that may be helpful for sentencing purposes. So in that spirit, I don't ask questions like, could he control himself generally, and could he control himself at the time of the offense? Rather, I look to factors that help explain what diminished his control in general and what diminished his control at the time of the offenses for which he's been convicted. I don't ask, did he have a choice? I work from an assumption that, of course, he had a choice in doing what he did. But this evaluation focuses on what kinds of things throughout the course of his life have shaped his choices. Not did he know right from wrong, but what kinds of things shaped his understanding of morality, what kinds of things helped develop his value system. And then finally, in this type of evaluation, I'm not addressing what he did. That has been presented. You all have deliberated and concluded what happened. So I don't address that in my evaluation. Instead, I address what kinds of things have impacted Tony over the course of his life that allowed us to get to where we're at today. So what has happened to him? Has he been damaged in any way? And so my focus is on presenting that information for your consideration during sentencing.
Going to your next slide. Were you able to interview Tony Anthony Pardon in this case?
I was.
Now, explain to the jury the next slide that you've put on the overhead.
Sure. So this just illustrates kind of my thought process as I go through the evaluation and as I present to you as a jury who has to make a recommendation on sentencing. Is I start with an assumption that every individual has a fairly high level of moral culpability, meaning that they're they're blameworthy, they're worthy of punishment for their offending behaviors. And then I assess whether or not there are psychologically impairing or damaging factors, with the assumption that as those damaging or impairing factors go up, moral culpability goes down. Not to say that the individual is not worthy of punishment. Certainly legally, anybody found guilty is worthy of punishment. But the question is, what punishment should be recommended? And so I present, are there any impairing or damaging factors that are worthy of consideration during those deliberations?
Dr. Stinson, looking at that last diagram, will you be able to explain to the jurors what you mean by the damaging or impairing factors, which makes the moral culpability align, tilt down, which makes the choices fall down? Will you be able to explain that at some point?
Yes, I believe that will essentially be the crux of my presentation today, is what damaging or impairing factors did I find to be present over the course of Tony's life, and what impact does that have on his development, and what contribution does that have to us being here today?
I believe your next slide is the method of evaluation.
Yes.
Can you explain to the jurors your methods, what you use, your methods for making the evaluations in this case?
Sure. So obviously I'll be consulting with attorneys that are on the case. What information do you have? Give me the facts of the case so I have a sense of what happened here. Who have you talked to, or what records do you have, and can you share with me? So consultation with the attorneys is obviously part of the evaluation. Consultation with other members of the defense team, if there are investigators that are going out and getting information. Sometimes we use what are called mitigation specialists, and they're really specialists in going out and getting background information about families, getting the history, getting the context that the person grew up in. And so I, of course, will consult with them to see what they've learned about Tony and his family. I'll review any and all records that I can get. Thank you. And I'll talk, I think, momentarily about what records I had in this case. But typically in a capital case, the idea is to try to review as much as you can so that by the conclusion of the evaluation, you have a full picture and a comprehensive understanding of the individual that has been evaluated. Obviously, I'll go and interview Tony, and that is typically done over the course of multiple interviews over time. In this case, you'll see that it was, I think, 3 different interviews, totaling almost 9 hours of face-to-face time with him over the course of months. And then finally, I do a literature review, which is to say, obviously I study my field on a continuous basis, but I may do specific research related to the issues that are relevant in this case.
Thank you, Doctor. You put together a slide that indicates the method of evaluation. I think you were just indicating to the jurors. Maybe you might want to repeat it. The 8.7 hours that was spent, that you have documented there, what was those 8.7 hours spent?
So the 8 3/4 or so hours was the time that I was actually face-to-face with Tony, meeting with him in a private room at the county jail, getting information from him, assessing him, doing my actual individual evaluation of him. I also, of course, got information from family members. Most of that typically comes from a third party, somebody who's interviewed family members, and then they give me a summary of what the family members have said, although I did talk briefly with one of his sisters as well. And then the review of records. In this case, I was presented with over 3,000 pages of records. I want to say a couple of things about those records. One is, despite it being over 3,000 pages, I don't consider it a comprehensive set of records. I know that there are other records out there that, for one reason or another, we were not able to get. His family was heavily involved with children's services, for example. We didn't get the children's services records. There's probably, I would imagine, some helpful information in there in terms of understanding him and his family, but I don't have those records. Certain placement records. Tony was placed outside of his home as a kid. I don't have those records. I don't have all of his school records. So I want you to understand that I don't necessarily have a comprehensive set of records, even though we were able to get over 3,000 pages of records. The other thing I want to make clear as I get into my testimony is I have not been through the entire over 3,000 pages of records that are available. I got a disc on Saturday evening, just this past Saturday evening, that included about 2,800 pages of records. I did the best I could, but I didn't get through 2,800 pages of records from Saturday night until today. I had other things I was doing for this case and other obligations. I did the best I could, but there may be things in those records that I simply have not been able to review.
An overview of your mitigation findings.
Sure. So this is just kind of just high-level bullet points that I think are relevant to Tony and his case and to the issue of sentencing in his case. The first is that he had a fairly physically abusive father. And at least according to one report that came through Tony's sister and mom, potentially a sexually abusive father. He had a mother, despite whatever her intentions may have been, by most standards would be considered a neglectful mother. I think she has had difficulty at times acknowledging that. Sometimes she has acknowledged it, but the record is clear to me that she was not available and, in fact, neglectful at times. There was a strong family history of mental health problems, a strong family history of drug and alcohol problems, and a strong family history of legal problems. So again, just kind of given the bullet points, and I'm sure we'll talk about the specifics, but these are findings from my evaluation. There was a lot of residential mobility, meaning that Tony at one point in time was moving about every 6 months. It was never really clear to me why that was. Sometimes it's because families can't pay the bills and they get evicted. Sometimes it's because they are having problems in the neighborhood and they move or get run out. I don't know why he was moving, but he was moving fairly frequently as a young kid, which disrupted his education. Because he was transferring to different schools, and he was an individual with special needs and special education. And that's hard enough when you have a consistent school. His residential mobility appears to have impacted his education as well. And then there were a number of what we call in my field ACEs, or other adverse childhood experiences. And I believe we'll talk at length about what ACEs are and the impact that ACEs have on people. But in Tony's case, there were a number of ACEs that will be relevant. And then even past his childhood, we'll see that Tony has experienced a number of significant traumas as an adult. And I'll talk about those as we go along. Probably as a product of all this, maybe destined because of all this, he develops a conduct disorder in his childhood that grows into what is referred to as an antisocial personality disorder during his adult years. He also became addicted to alcohol. He developed some psychological disorders, including depression, and post-traumatic stress disorder, along with some anxiety symptoms. And then finally, although I can't do brain imaging or brain testing, that's another expert's role, but there's a lot of indications that he may in fact have neurological impairment or brain damage, and we'll talk about what some of those indicators are and why I say that. A last thing that it's not on this slide, but I think it's relevant in Tony's case and worthy of discussion and consideration, is really what I would characterize as multi-systemic failure in his life. And by that, I mean to say I agree with something his mom wrote years ago in a letter that she sent to the parole board, which is Tony's mom failed him, Tony's family failed him, the educational system failed him, social services failed him, and the legal system failed him. That's not to say that Tony doesn't have responsibility for who Tony is, but I think it's important in this context to understand the failures that happened along the way and the impact that that had on his development.
Dr. Stinson, would it be a good time to talk about some of those failures, or is that something we want to touch on later on in your presentation?
I'm happy to do it whenever you'd like. Now would be fine.
When you say he had the failures, can you tell the jurors specifically what you're referring to? In other words, let's start with Tony's upbringing. And based on your knowledge, did Tony have a normal upbringing?
Tony did not have a normal upbringing. If I had to pick a single word to describe his family and the household in which he was brought up during his early developmental years, I'd probably use the word dysfunction. Whether it was his mom or his dad or his siblings, a lot of dysfunction. He was involved early on with children's services, the family was. You can see that in certain court records where there's a temporary court commitment, which means he's committed to the custody of children's services. He's described as a ward of the court. And so he kind of gets transferred custody over to children's services. His mom's in prison when he's in 3rd grade. So that's causing problems. As I said earlier, his dad was violent. So we start to see very early on in his life that there's a lot of chaos, a lot of dysfunction, a lot of unhealthiness. And that's important because he's learning at that age how life works, how to adapt, how to function as an individual.
Did he get any, to your knowledge and through your evaluation, any positive training? Or did he have any models for any positive training?
He did not. If you look at the reports that I was able to get through, I tried to look through some of the psychosocial histories and psychology reports that were done on him. We see a lot of recommendations that were made for Tony. And the vast majority, if not all of them, never got fulfilled. Very early on, a psychiatrist had written in one of his reports that Tony needed a normal upbringing and training, which is kind of our way in a report of saying he needs out of this dysfunction. Tony did go, as I said, into the care and custody of children's services, but as soon as his mom got out of prison, the plan was to place him right back into that dysfunctional environment. There were some educators who saw that Tony was actually doing better when he was out of that home. They advocated for Tony to stay out of the home because they saw him making progress. What got reported to me was that one teacher in particular called children's services and was told, "You do your job and we'll do ours." And it's that kind of attitude that allowed Tony to not get the services that were being recommended. Even today, if we talk about multi-systemic failures, even today, we requested children's services records and we haven't gotten them. So there's just a disconnect between these social services and really helping the individual who's in need of the services. So that's one example of the failure. Other recommendations were made. Again, looking at the reports that I had available to me, not only was normal upbringing and training recommended, psychiatric treatment was recommended. He didn't get the psychiatric treatment that he needed. At one point in time, he was getting medication for ADHD, but even then his mom discontinued that medication. So he never got the psychiatric treatment that was recommended. One report recommended extensive counseling. The best I could find from the records I reviewed, he got no counseling. He certainly didn't get extensive counseling. There was a recommendation for sex offender treatment. There's a psychologist that said he needs sex offender treatment in the prison system, and he needs to get sex offender treatment after he leaves prison. To my surprise and somewhat appallingly, he never got any sex offender treatment. There's documentation over a 5-year period of him actually asking for those services while he was incarcerated, and he never got the services. He was released after years and years of incarceration with no sex offender treatment, with no recommendation for sex offender treatment even in the community. So that was another failure. There were recommendations in the records, in the psychology reports, for residential treatment upon leaving incarceration. He didn't get that. Recommendation for a halfway house. He didn't get that. A recommendation for slow transition to independent living because he would have difficult time adjusting in the community. He didn't get that. A recommendation for educational skills. He was 23 years old and reading at the 3rd grade level. Eventually his reading levels went up as he did some educational study while incarcerated, but his math and language levels continued to be at the 2nd or 3rd grade level. So he never got the educational skills he needed. He had no vocational skills when he was released into the community. It was recommended that he get close parole supervision. Instead, he was categorized as a moderate risk instead of a high risk, and as far as I could tell, had very little, if any, supervision. It was recommended that he have random urine screens, that they scrutinize who his associates were. The best I could tell, none of that happened. So from the time he was a child until the time he was arrested in this case, we just see multiple failures across multiple systems, whether it's the family or children's services, the juvenile court, the education system, the prison system. Again, not to suggest Tony doesn't have responsibility. He does. That's why we're here. He's been convicted. He'll be punished. But I think for sentencing purposes, it's worthy of considering that there were a lot of systemic failures in this person's life.
Dr. Stinson, I don't know if you know off the top of your head, have you done the math? Do you know how much time Tony has actually served in the institution?
So I may not get this exactly right, but I think I'll be pretty close. My understanding is he committed an offense at age 16, and by the time he was 17, he got bound over to the adult court, meaning they were going to try his case as an adult instead of a juvenile. So starting from the time he committed the offense at 16, gets locked up as an adult at 17, basically does 25 years in prison, gets out, and within a few months, he gets picked back up for a case where he failed to register. He's supposed to register as a sex offender when he got out. He failed to register. And then he committed some fraud. I think he was using a different name. The accusation was that he was doing that to avoid having to register. He gets sentenced to 30 more years. He does 10 years of that time before he gets back out of prison. And then at that point in time, he's got essentially almost 20 full years that he could be supervised on parole and these recommendations could be implemented. None of them were implemented, and it's my understanding that it was about 6 months later when he was arrested on this case. So for the better part of the last 35 years, he had been incarcerated.
And when you indicate that he did not get residential treatment or a halfway house, are you saying that after he did that full 25 years, he was released, but he did not get any programming at a halfway house or any other help trying to readjust to society after being away 25 years?
That's what I see from the records, is he essentially got out and was on his own. Obviously, he went away at a young age. He was still a child. He was still 16. He was 16 years old when he committed the offense for which he was incarcerated as an adult. So he had never lived a single adult day on the streets and had 25 years of technology and time and life that passed him by while he was incarcerated. Got out without any supports, without any kind of guardrails in place, and then failed to register and went back in.
And in your line of work, Doctor, what would you consider those valuable years between 16 and, say, 24? I know there's different studies, but the brain, the growing of the brain, the impressions that the brain gets, what happens during those years from 16 to 24?
Yeah, so those are kind of critical years in terms of brain development, in terms of moral development. The general school of thought is our brain is developing until about our mid-20s. More recent neuroscience will actually say our brain's developing into our 30s. There's what is called neuropruning going on, some fine-tuning, if you will. But our brain is not fully developed until we're about in our mid-20s. And the brain develops really from the back to the front. So the last part of your brain to develop is the frontal lobe. And the frontal lobe is responsible for things like reasoning and exercising good judgment and planning things and thinking things through, anticipating consequences, controlling your impulses. So at the time that he goes into prison at age 17, for the next 7 or 8 years, his brain is still developing, but it's now developing. Your brain is influenced by your environment, and the development is impacted by your environment. So he's developing very much like those who are around him, which is literally thousands of other criminals.
Now, that development, during that stage, the early stages of life, between the ages of 3 and, say, 24, does that change because you get to be 55, or are those set and your brain is developed and that stays with you the rest of your life?
Well, not just the brain development. That's why you'll see, I think, as I go through some of the information that I think is relevant for mitigation purposes, a lot of it has to do with early development and childhood, because not only is that creating the neural pathways in our brain and the moral development in our value system, but we're learning. If you think about everything that you know in the world, only a very small fraction of it came from direct instruction in a school setting. The vast majority of everything we know, we picked up incidentally. We saw people doing it. We saw it modeled at home or in the neighborhood. We heard it on the radio. We overheard other people in the neighborhood talking. And so it's not just the brain development that lasts a lifetime, but it's those early developmental experiences that tell us how to relate to other people, how to respect authority, how to react when you're upset, how to make decisions, how to solve problems. All of those things are impacted from early on, and then as the brain becomes more fully developed, it becomes a little bit more difficult to change those things.
So the training and education that he got during that period I believe you indicated that he got that while he was in the institution around other criminals.
The majority of his life experiences have come from his years of institutionalization, whether as a juvenile when he was in group homes and facilities, or whether as an adult. And so what he saw modeled at home was dysfunctional, but what he saw modeled in the institutions was just as dysfunctional. So in what he has as his life experience, frankly, is dysfunction.
I'm sorry, Doctor.
And I should say, just to be fair and to be clear, there may be moments. Like there was a period when he was a child. He was living with his grandparents, and he had a counselor at school who was trying to help him, and a kindergarten teacher who was trying to help him when he was third grade. So I don't want to suggest that there's absolutely never a time where somebody was trying to help. There were, and we actually saw progress during those times, but over the course of his life, those are just blips on a map. The vast majority of his experiences come from these dysfunctional things that I'm talking about.
Thank you, Dr. Stinson. I want to go back to your slide presentation and tell the members of the jury, if we could go to the next slide, explain the insufficient parental structure. Parental structure, I'm sorry.
Sure. So this gets at the last question that was just asked, which is, a lot of times people say, well, why do you psychologists care about what happened when they were 2, 3, 4, 5, 10, 12, 18? Who cares? This offense occurred when he was in his 50s. The reason I care, and the reason I suggest you give it consideration, is because these early interactions, these early relationships they kind of map out where this person is going as an adult. They map out not just in terms of the brain, as I said earlier, but in terms of how we think about solving problems, exercising judgment, making decisions, so on and so forth. So the research I cite here, I tried not to put in too much research. I understand that we can get bogged down in that, and it can be boring for people who haven't selected psychology as their field of study. But I put it in here to make the connection between why it's important to understand early development and appreciating what's going on currently. So these research findings come from research that was sponsored by the United States Department of Justice and published in journals authored by the American Psychological Association. And the general findings are that healthy child development requires structure and limit setting and guidance through appropriate discipline. And it probably stands to reason. That might be intuitive. It might be common sense. Of course, to have a healthy child, you want to have structure and limit setting and appropriate discipline. In fact, what we have found is that children need that external structure in order to develop internal structures and in order to develop self-guidance. If you think about child development and you think about toddlers and what's appropriate during the developmental stage of toddlerhood, they have tantrums because they haven't developed self-control. They don't know how to regulate their frustrations and their emotions. And it's through that structure and through consistency and through appropriate discipline that they internalize self-control and self-guidance. It doesn't just happen. It actually comes through the experiences that they have during their childhood. And those individuals who get that go on to show good self-control and self-regulation as adults. Individuals during their childhood who don't get this go on to have what we call emotional dysregulation. They don't know how to manage frustration. They don't know how to cope with anger. They don't know how to deal with their emotions. And so that started way back in their childhood when they didn't get appropriate structure and appropriate consistency and appropriate external guidance. So when guidance is not provided, then self-control doesn't develop. And when we don't have self-control, then aggression can unfold. In fact, it's been shown through the research that children who come from families who fail to provide adequate supervision and adequate structure and discipline exhibit far more delinquent behaviors than children who come from environments where that stuff is provided. So if we say, well, what's the take-home message on this line of the research? That simply put, lack of parental discipline, appropriate parental discipline, lack of structure and consistency contributes to and predisposes one to go on and be an aggressive person and to exhibit violence in the community. That's why lack of parental structure in childhood is relevant when we're talking about adult cases.
And so if I was to say to you that you take an individual and his mother is not there to give him discipline, or she's not there to add support, that she's absent on several occasions, that he lives with a father who is abusive and beats him and provides no positive reinforcement whatsoever, that he's never encouraged to go to school or get an education, that he has psychological problems. Would that cause what you're describing in your overlay, in your overhead?
Those are kind of classic examples of what we're talking about when we talk about insufficient parental structure that results in underdeveloped or undeveloped self-control that contributes to later aggression and problems in the community.
Doctor, has it been your experience that if a child witnesses certain types of behavior, that oftentimes has the child mimicking that same behavior?
Absolutely. So part of how kids learn is to see what's going on around them. They may emulate the behaviors that they see displayed by their parents or by other adults in their life. They may adapt the problem-solving strategies that they see in their home. The exercise of judgment may be contaminated by what they experience when they're a child.
Doug, let me ask you, I know you've been doing this a while. Have you ever ran across a situation where at some point, this may be unique, I don't know, just tell us, that during the course of your doing evaluations, that every member of the family was locked up in prison at one time? At the same time. Not different times, but all of them locked up in prison. Is that a unique situation, or is that something that you've seen occur before? Talk to us about that, would you?
I do a lot of evaluations on a lot of dysfunctional people and a lot of dysfunctional families. I've never seen what you just described. I've seen where, every household member has been in trouble with the law or been on drugs. I don't know that I can't recall a situation where every single family member was locked up at the same time.
And that's probably saying as long as they weren't all involved in one crime at one time, but I'm just individual crimes and their individual behavior, and it just so happens they all land in prison. What does that tell you about the parental guidance and the structure?
Well, certainly if you have both parents getting locked up and everybody in the home is getting locked up, it probably doesn't take a forensic psychologist to think there's probably something not going well in that home. There are obviously some problems in that home. That's a pretty remarkable situation. We can probably all in our own families think of somebody, at least in the extended family, who's had problems and gotten into trouble. But to take a single household and have both parents and all children in trouble with the law for different reasons at the same time is clearly, to me, suggestive of significant dysfunction.
Now I'm going to move to the abuse and neglect.
Yes, yeah, so again, this is just some of the research around abuse and neglect because, again, I think it's a fair question to say, why do we care if somebody was abused or neglected during their childhood? We're not talking about what they did during their childhood. We're talking about them as a responsible adult now. But I think it's important to understand that the research informs us that individuals who experience abuse and neglect in childhood are predisposed to and at risk for more problems during their adult years as well. So a child who is abused or neglected, and Tony was, he was abused and neglected, are almost 5 times more likely than non-abused, non-neglected children to be arrested as juveniles. And we know Tony was arrested as a juvenile. In fact, he was bound over to the adult system and incarcerated as an adult, even when he was a juvenile. They're 2 times more likely to be arrested as adults. So that's why I put that up there to say it doesn't just go away. Being abused or neglected as a child places you at twice the risk of being arrested as an adult and over 3 times the risk of being arrested for a violent offense. So abuse and neglect have long-standing impact beyond childhood. Domestic violence, similarly. If a person as a child witnesses domestic violence, the research shows us that those individuals have reactions that are very similar to individuals who have been abused or neglected themselves. In Tony's case, he had all 3. He was abused, there was neglect, and he witnessed domestic violence. There's one study, and I think this is the last research slide I have on the abuse and neglect. Again, I resist the temptation to go on and on about the research, but there was one study that was done. It's coined or named the Rochester Youth Development Study. Again, it was sponsored by the United States Department of Justice. And they looked at 3 types of violence in the home. They looked at spousal abuse, which was present in Tony's case. They looked at abuse of children, which was present in Tony's home. And they looked at a climate of violence and hostility generally, which was also present in Tony's home. And they determined through the research that there's an incremental effect, meaning if you experience one type of violence, that places you at a 60% increased risk for going on and committing serious youth violence yourself. If you experience 2 of those, you have a 73% increase. And if you experience all 3 of them, as Tony did, you're almost 80% more likely to go on and have serious youthful violence, which is exactly what played out in Tony's case. So if I can, the core principle that we take away from this lack of parental structure, child abuse, child neglect, domestic violence is a core principle in the field, and that is that the quality of our attachments as children, the quality of those attachments to our parents and to other members of our family during childhood is central to how that child will relate to and value other members of society as an adult. It's not you turn 18 and your childhood goes away and now you're responsible for being responsible. Those relationships map out what your relationships are likely to look like into your adulthood. The influence of family environment on the child's social development lasts a lifetime.
Doctor, what about the core principle?
That's what I just went over, was that core principle.
No, okay, let's go to family and mental health.
Sure.
Can we talk about that for a minute? And I believe you already related that a lot of the factors that are found in your research or have been talked about by the Department of Justice and the American Board of Psychiatrists, Anthony fits that mold. So,
Anthony does fit that mold. He had, the research I've talked about up to this point has to do with lack of parental structure, being exposed to abuse, neglect, domestic violence. Those are all things that he's experienced. So this research is directly relevant to Tony and his development.
I want to take you off script for just 1 minute because I found, let me ask you, if a child is, say, 6 years old, 7 years old, 8 years old, and they're prescribed a drug called Ritalin, can you tell the members of the jury what is Ritalin and its effect on a child?
Sure. So Ritalin is categorized as a psychostimulant, and it's generally used in the treatment of ADHD, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. It might seem counterintuitive that, well, why are we giving a child who's hyperactive and impulsive, why are we giving them a stimulant? But the way these types of stimulants work is they stimulate the part of the brain that's responsible for inhibiting impulses and slowing down the hyperactivity. So I think for our purposes, what's important to understand is Ritalin is designed to treat ADHD. The primary signs and symptoms of ADHD being hyperactivity, impulsivity, and or inattention. The medications can be very effective for that reason, but they can also have some unfortunate side effects. They sometimes can suppress one's appetite, make somebody not hungry, and then they stop their physical development in childhood. So there's various reasons why somebody might choose not to want to use those medications. But when they're prescribed, they're typically prescribed to control the symptoms of ADHD.
Now, should that stop without a doctor, a physician saying that we want to take the child off? In other words, if you heard a testimony from a mother who said that her son was prescribed this drug, and without consulting any doctors or any physicians, she took that person off of the drugs, what would be your initial reaction to that, and what effects do you think that might have on the child?
Well, my initial reaction would be obviously to discourage that. I think we should always be careful in going off any medication that's been prescribed by a physician. Some medications you need to be weaned off so that you don't see an increase in the problem that it was treating in the first place, or so that you don't have significant side effects as you're coming off the medication. So I certainly would discourage abruptly stopping any medication that's been prescribed and taken. I also think, because I had the benefit of looking at the records, that Tony was in significant need of some intervention. If it wasn't going to be medication, it had to be something else. So to just stop that treatment that was being offered and not work with the physician or other treatment providers to do anything else seems to me to be significantly problematic as well.
Thank you, Doc. We'll go back to the family mental health. And I didn't mean to interrupt you, but can you now talk about the mental illness profoundly affecting an individual's ability to think, feel, and act?
Yeah, this is just illustrating some of the research that has come out from the National Institute on Mental Health. And it's looking at what is the impact of family mental health problems. And really, a history of family mental health problems works against an individual in two ways. The first, and I have it up here, that it profoundly affects the individual who has a mental illness, affects their ability to think, feel, and act. So if Tony is being raised by a mother who has mental health problems, his mom, by definition, has a condition that is impacting her thinking and feeling and behaviors. So he's at a disadvantage if she's not managing her mental health appropriately, and indications are that she was not necessarily managing her mental health. I don't mean to suggest that any child who has a parent who has mental health problems is doomed. That's simply not the case. But you want to be able to manage that mental health problem. The other avenue by which a family history of mental health has an impact on an individual is most mental illnesses have a genetic component. It's not a one-to-one relationship. It's not that if I have a mental illness, my child is automatically going to have a mental illness. But it's pretty clear from the research that there's a genetic component. So a person who has a mother with a mental health problem, like Tony did, he's at an increased risk for developing mental health problems. And he, in fact, does develop his own mental health problems. So it's both through the environment and through genetics that a family history of mental health problems puts a child at risk for their own problems later in life.
Thank you, Doctor. Moving on to the next slide.
Yeah, so the next slide really talks about genetic vulnerability to alcoholism, and I'll try to make this succinct because it's somewhat repetitive with the past slide. Tony had family members, actually all of his family members, have drug and or alcohol problems. Every single one in his immediate family, and many apparently in his extended family, have drug and alcohol problems. That places him at risk. If he has a first-degree biological relative with a drug or alcohol problem, and he had two, actually, both of his parents, he's at 4 to 5 times the risk compared to general population. So it's almost a super high risk that he's going to develop problems of his own. If we look at how do drug and alcohol problems develop, and Tony developed significant alcohol use problems. Genetic predisposition, which he had, modeling of substance abuse and dependence in the home, which he had by way of his parents and his siblings for that matter, and then developmental trauma and instability. So he's got all three of these. The three main risk factors that contribute to the development of drug and alcohol problems existed during his development.
And I think that goes back to when Tony was taken off of drugs, there was probably a need for some type of medication. And if you couldn't get it prescribed, as if the other kids needed medication, then they would go out and use alcohol and drugs to self-medicate. Is that?
So there certainly can be a self-medication or maladaptive coping that is contributes to the development of drug and alcohol problems. So if, for example, I have severe ADHD or other problems, mood problems that aren't being managed, perhaps I'm more inclined to like the feeling of being intoxicated because it calms me down or it slows my mind down. Indeed, if we kind of fast forward to shortly before this case and talk to Tony about his significant alcohol use at that time, he talked about trying to cope with all that was going on. He was overwhelmed. And again, not making excuses for him, but who wouldn't be overwhelmed after being incarcerated for 35 years and coming out with really no supports or guardrails in place? So he talked about using alcohol to just kind of cope with this overwhelming sense of responsibility he had, not knowing how to get a job as a convicted felon, not knowing how to get money and provide for himself. So he talked about using alcohol as a way to just kind of avoid all that. So that certainly can happen where people are using drugs or alcohol in what they believe is an attempt to cope, and it is an attempt, but it's a maladaptive attempt to cope.
And I think you indicated that in a situation where a person is released with no other treatment or no transition, no period or transitional anything, facing the world after 35 years could be a daunting task.
I think it would be an extremely daunting task. And in this case in particular, a person who never lived really as an adult, right? So tackling the responsibilities as an adult is a task. Adjusting after a long period of incarceration is a challenge. But to take on adult responsibilities really for the first time in your life after a significant long period of incarceration becomes really, really difficult. And that's why I think of, talk about supports, or I like to think of them as guardrails, right? We had no real guardrails in place. So surely something's going to go awry here. The recommendations were, I think, spot on. A slow acclimation, a halfway house, a residential program, help with independent skills, get him educated, get him job training. But none of that happened.
Doctor, did we talk about the development of drugs and alcohol problems?
We did.
So we move on to residential mobility, and then I think you were explaining to the jurors a little earlier about that moving around when you're a child.
Yeah, and again, I think I'm wrapping up the slides I put in on research, so I promise not much more on research. But there has been research on residential mobility in childhood and the impact that that can have long-term. We see that children who have significant residential mobility, and Anthony did, right? I think if I counted right in one of the records, he was in 9 or 10 different schools in about 5 years. So it places them at higher risk for delinquency. It places them at higher risk for drug use. We have found this across major cities, so it's kind of a consistent finding. And it places them at higher risk of being under or uneducated, because as they're changing residences, oftentimes they're changing schools. That was the case in Tony's circumstances. And they're not getting continuity in their educational services. And if they have special education needs like Tony did, they're falling through the cracks, and the services that they need are not being placed timely.
Doctor, would you explain what you mean by adverse childhood experience? And I think that's what you call ACE, the ACEs?
Yeah, ACEs.
ACEs.
It's just an acronym for adverse childhood experiences. There's been a lot of study of 10 particular adverse childhood experiences, and they fall in one of 3 categories: abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. And so under abuse, we have physical abuse, emotional abuse, and sexual abuse. Under neglect, we have physical neglect. You don't have housing or clothing or food. And then we have emotional neglect. People just aren't there for you, supporting you emotionally. And then we look at 5 household dysfunction variables. Things like, is there a family history of mental illness, or does somebody in the home have a mental illness? Was your mother treated violently? Were your parents divorced or separated? Did you have a relative who lived in the home who was incarcerated? Was there substance abuse going on in the home? And what we have found is that these ACEs, these adverse childhood experiences, are actually fairly common. So if you're looking and thinking, well, hey, I have one of those, congratulations. A lot of us do. So don't be too alarmed because you have one. They're fairly common. Almost 2/3 of the population reports at least one ACE, one adverse childhood experiences. However, some populations are more vulnerable to experiencing these adverse childhood experiences because of the circumstances they live in, or that they were brought up in, or the circumstances of their neighborhoods. And what's important to understand about these adverse childhood experiences is there's what's called a dose-graded response, meaning we understand that a lot of people have one of these, maybe even 2. Yeah, some even have 3. But the dose-graded response means the more you have, the higher risk you are for a variety of negative outcomes, right? And in fact, individuals who have 4 or more are at an especially increased risk. So a lot of people have 1, some have 2. We've got a handful that even have 3. But if you have 4 or more, you're at an increased risk for negative outcomes. And your risk continues to go up with each additional adverse childhood experience that you've been exposed to. So we'll talk about Tony's adverse childhood experiences. But for now, I think it's really important to understand, and you've probably gathered, that he's been exposed to a lot more than just 4. So he's at an especially increased risk for negative outcomes. And you might say, well, what negative outcomes? These adverse childhood experiences have been linked to over 40 different negative outcomes, including health-related negative outcomes like cardiac disease, including risky behaviors like drug and alcohol, including social and emotional problems like violence and victimization of violence. So there's a host of negative outcomes that come with being exposed to an increased number of adverse childhood experiences. Now I really am done with the research.
So let's kind of look at Tony's situation as far as the adverse childhood experience, the ACEs. And I think that at some point you'll tell these folks, based on your diagram, how many of these ACEs Tony had in his life.
I will. And so as not to hold you in suspense, Tony, if you look at those 10 adverse childhood experiences, Tony had 9 of the 10. And as I said, if you have 4 or more, you're at a significantly increased risk for these negative outcomes. And there's a dose-specific response. So a person with 5 is at a higher risk, 6, higher risk, 7, so on and so forth. Tony had 9 of the 10. The only one he didn't have was the physical neglect. He said, look, I always had shelter, I always had clothing, I always had food. Now, sometimes it was through an abusive father, sometimes it was through an institution, but he wasn't physically neglected. That's the one thing he can claim about the adverse childhood experiences. But he experienced all 9 of the other adverse childhood experiences that we study.
So looking at your slide, mitigation, Tony had an abusive father. He had a neglectful mother. He had a family of mental health problems. Doctor, I'll let you go and read them.
Yeah, this is, again, just the overview again. Just saying that, you know, if we look at what's mitigation in this case, what was discovered through a psychological evaluation of Tony and his family and his circumstances. As was just said, he had an abusive father and a neglectful mother. He had a family history of significant mental health problems and drug and alcohol problems. Family problem with legal history. Residential mobility that impacted on his education. The adverse childhood experiences, 9 out of the 10 that I was just talking about. He experienced adult trauma, which we haven't gotten into yet, but I will get into that. He's developed behavior problems that evolved into an antisocial personality disorder, and I'll talk more about that. And developed psychological problems of his own. And as I said, may have brain damage. Again, I that's not my expertise to assess for that. He'd have to go to somebody else to get imaging, but I'll review with you some of the indicators, some of the concerns that I have. And again, not on this slide, but I've mentioned it, just this multi-systemic failure that occurred early on and throughout Tony's life. Those are at the high level, general mitigation factors in Tony's case.
Specifically, we'll talk about the abusive father.
So looking at the specifics, and it's my understanding that some family were going to testify, so perhaps you've already heard about some of this, but Tony's dad was an abusive alcoholic. By most family accounts, Tony and one of his brothers took the brunt of it. They got beat worse than most of the others. That's not uncommon in abusive households, that one person is kind of the chosen one, if you will. There were examples that Tony's dad would beat on Tony's mom, but would also beat on Tony. His mom tells of a story where she came home and he was 6 years old and sitting there in his underwear, and she could see the bruises that had been left. So not just a spanking or a whooping or, discipline that was, appropriate for the times. These were abusive beatings that were leaving marks. In fact, his dad at one point in time is charged with a felony domestic violence for the severity of the abuse that he's perpetrating in the home. So there may be other examples. There are other examples, but this gives you a taste of what was going on. Not just a disciplinarian, but an abuser.
What about the neglectful mother?
Yeah, so mom had her struggles. She went to prison when Tony was 8 years old. She's actually been to prison twice for a period of about 2 years when Tony was about 8 to 10 years old. So pretty critical age period. Mom was gone for 2 years. Family members talk about mom kind of leaving and kind of running around with a married man, not her husband, but another man. And for this 2-year period left her children. At one time, she described it as kind of needing a break. And I should say, his mom probably did need a break. She was extremely, a very young mom, had her first child, I believe, at 16 or 17, and had one kid every year after that for the next 6 years. So she's a young, overwhelmed, struggling mom of her own, and not there physically or emotionally for Tony while he's getting beat by his dad. If you talk to Tony about, who was responsible for raising you, primarily, who brought you up, he'll tell you, I was raised by the state. That's not a good situation. It certainly wasn't when he was being brought up through the state system. He was in foster homes. He named a number of group homes. So he didn't have it well at home, and then the alternative wasn't much better for him. His mom wasn't available, and his dad was beating on him.
Family mental health problems.
Family mental health problems. Mom has indicated that she has struggled with bipolar disorder, not always properly managed. A brother has been psychiatrically hospitalized. It was described to me as on the Hilltop, which I know to be a state psychiatric hospital on West Broad Street here in Columbus. And when you talk to him about, who in your family had mental health problems that you're aware of, he doesn't really know how to describe it. He says everybody was kind of crazy. That's how our family was. So there was significant mental health problems in the family, and as I mentioned earlier, that of course places him at risk, and indeed he did develop his own mental health problems.
Family drug and alcohol problems.
Sure. Family drug and alcohol problems. We've already talked about dad being an alcoholic. If you ask Tony who in your family drank, he says everybody. I mean, what do you mean who drank? Why would you ask that question? Everybody drank alcohol in the family, and to abusive levels, not just social drinkers, but abusively. He had siblings who used crack cocaine, and in fact, were or are addicted to crack cocaine. Extended family, uncles using heroin, aunts, uncles, grandparents. So it wasn't just mom and dad and brothers and sisters, but his entire family circle, whether we extend out to cousins and aunts and uncles, grandparents. Drug and alcohol problems were prominent. Again, problematic because it predisposes him genetically, and problematic because he grows up thinking that's normal. That's what people do. We abuse drugs and alcohol. That's how we cope. That's what we do.
I think we talked about we need to go into family legal problems.
Right. And I mentioned this. Mom went to prison when he was 8 years old. Mom's actually been to prison twice. I was asked earlier about all the family members being incarcerated at one time. One of Tony's brothers talked about, when he was the only one not incarcerated, and everyone else in the family was incarcerated, and he's got to figure out who he's going to support and how he's going to support them while they're incarcerated. His dad, I said, had a felony domestic violence charge, also had a receiving stolen property charge. When you ask Tony, who in your family has been to prison, he says, everybody, except I have one brother who hadn't been to prison. But that brother's been to jail, right? So everybody in his family has been incarcerated for criminal activity. This was the environment he came up in. This was his normal as he was growing up.
Did he share with you that one of his brothers was actually incarcerated with him?
He did not specifically share that, but I came to learn about that. That he and his brother actually were in prison at the same time and shared a cell. So it was kind of like, for lack of a better way of putting it, their homecoming. They spent time in prison together. That's where the family The entire family spent time in prison.
Residential, and I believe you talked about the educational effects and other effects of the constant moving around.
Yeah, I talked about why that's problematic, and I think I said at that time too, this was the case for Tony. You know, 8, 9, 10 different schools in a short period of time. He's got ADHD, he's in special education. When that happens, you fall through the cracks educationally. You don't, your special education program doesn't follow you and sometimes doesn't even catch up with you because you're moving schools too fast. That's why we have a person who at age 23 was only reading at a 3rd grade level. That's why despite increasing his reading levels through education while incarcerated to the 8th grade level, he still had math and language skills that were at the 2nd or 3rd grade level. This residential mobility places you at risk of falling through the cracks educationally, which places you at risk for future problems. And that's what happened in Tony's case.
Let me ask you, Doc, while we're on that one. Once a child falls behind in school in different subjects, does that affect how they act? I mean, do they try to race to catch up, or do they act out?
Well, maybe both, right? It might not be an either or. Certainly, you hope there's a race to catch up. You hope the responsible adults in this person's orbit, if not responsible adults at home, because he probably didn't have that, but maybe responsible adults in the educational system, maybe they're hurrying to catch him up. But he was moving, sometimes twice in a school year. He was barely getting to a school. They barely were able to identify that he had problems and put a plan in place before he was gone and off to the next school and starting it over again. So it's not uncommon, particularly for boys, to act out when they're behind in school. It's sometimes easier to be in trouble or to be the clown or be the goofball than to be the dummy in the classroom. And so it doesn't surprise me that someone who fell behind early on, might take that role on.
Thank you. So now we're back at the ACEs again.
Yeah, and the ACEs, we've talked about these. I'll go through them, each one, so that you can kind of see what we're talking about being endorsed. I said he had 9 of the 10, and I already told you, he doesn't have the physical neglect, but he has the other 9. And so you understand what we're talking about. Not when we say physical abuse, I don't want you to think, okay, that just means there's one act of violence. In order to endorse physical abuse on the Adverse Childhood Experience Questionnaire, you have to endorse that your parent or an adult was often pushed, grabbed, slapped, or had something or threw something at you, or ever hit you so hard that you had marks or were injured. Both of those get endorsed in his case. This isn't just a little bit of discipline. This is actual physical abuse that's occurring. Emotional abuse. A parent or other adult often sweared at him, insulted him, put him down, and or humiliated him. Often act in a way that made him afraid that he might be physically hurt. Part of their discipline sometimes was to be put in their basement with lights off for hours at a time, with threats and angry outbursts going on and domestic violence going on in other parts of the home. He was isolated by his father. One of the times that he was beaten was because he had wet himself. So, it's not like this was discipline. It's not like Tony was acting out and he had to be disciplined, and that's what we're talking about. We're talking about actual significant abuse without adequate provocation for even discipline, let alone abuse. The sexual abuse. There was an allegation made by one of Tony's sisters to Tony's mom that she was sexually abused by Tony's dad. Mom didn't believe it, and sister and mom have since been estranged. But that accusation was made. Tony himself talked about when he was 7 or 8 years old and he would get picked up by the choir director, that there was an adolescent boy that would always make him sit on his lap and would touch him in uncomfortable, inappropriate sexual ways. He talked about his sister's boyfriend, who one time was trying to, who was about 6 years or so, I believe, older than Tony, trying to force him into anal sex, and unfortunately another person arrived, and that didn't come to happen. But those would be considered examples of sexual abuse in the home. Emotional neglect, often feeling that no one in your family loved you or thought that you were important or special. If you look at the psychology reports when he was later in his adolescence, young adulthood, they talk about very poor self-esteem and self-concept, and having the need to be nurtured. So these reports are identifying what's going on with him and saying what he needs that he just didn't get. He often felt that his family didn't look out for each other, didn't feel close to each other, and didn't support each other. Not surprising. His dad was abusing family members, his mom was running off, sometimes incarcerated, and all of the kids had drug and alcohol problems. Mental illness, we talked about that. His mom had bipolar disorder. His brother was psychiatrically hospitalized. His mother was often pushed, grabbed, slapped, or had something thrown at her. Sometimes kicked, hit with a fist, or hit with something. What's not included here is biting. Tony said, I don't recall her ever being bit. But it's a shame that you have to kind of keep going on to figure out what hasn't happened because of how much has happened and what he did witness. Repeatedly hit over at least a few minutes or threatened with a gun. Both. She was, according to Tony and according to Tony's mom, hospitalized because of the beating she took from Tony's dad at one point in time, and threatened with a gun previously. Tony talked about, Dad used to beat my mom real bad. I didn't get a sense of how bad it really was until I probed for details, especially from other family members. This was kind of the norm. So when you ask the family, give me examples, well, like just a bad beating. Well, it was a severe beating once you get the details, hospitalization. And as I said, the felony domestic violence charge. Divorce or separation, that of course happened. Mom was out of the house when Tony was 8 or 9 because she was in prison. She also ran off for a couple years when he was 8 to 10. His parents eventually separated. One of the reports pertaining to Tony when he was going through court as a later adolescent said his dad's whereabouts were unknown and he hadn't had any contact with his dad for years. So that one clearly was present as well. Talked about his mom and dad both going to prison. Talked about the family history of substance abuse, father, brother, sister, aunts, uncles, grandparents, everybody. And so if we look at the 10 adverse childhood experiences that, again, have that dose-specific risk, the more factors, the higher the risk, he meets 9 of the 10. That's very uncommon, obviously. Any one of us, 1, 2, maybe 3, we are at a higher risk when we get to 4. But for someone to have 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 is an extremely dysfunctional development, extremely dysfunctional home. And this chart just kind of shows that the risk goes up as you get past 4 and 5. It doesn't even go out to 8 and 9 and 10. But the dose-specific response tells us it gets worse as you get higher. And this is how it happens. If you're wondering, well, okay, I buy the study. The studies say that, but why? Why do these things impact on people so much? This is from the Centers for Disease Control. So this is what the government has put out as an explanation for these study findings. They say what happens, the people who experience these high number of ACEs, they come from a environment that has a generational embodiment of trauma. So it's not just Tony and his parents, but his parents and their parents, and generations back. So this happens because there's this multi-generational dysfunction going on in this family. And that leads Tony's parents into a social context that's ripe for continuing the same traumas generation after generation after generation. And in fact, he's born into these adverse childhood experiences, 9 out of 10 of them. And then we get this disrupted neural development. The brain development that we were talking about earlier is impacted by the environment that he's growing up on. We quite literally can change a person's brain structure and brain function by exposing them repeatedly to traumatic events, particularly during the developmental period. And that's what happens here. He's exposed to these adverse childhood experiences. He has this disrupted neural development, this brain dysfunction, and then he goes on to develop his own social and emotional and cognitive problems. He goes on to have behavior problems as a child. He goes on to need behavioral programming at school. He goes on to maybe develop a learning disability. He goes on to maybe have brain dysfunction. And then he adopts health risk behaviors, drug use, violence, skipping school, doing things impulsively. He takes on those behaviors, and then he develops his own psychological and behavior problems, conduct disorder, antisocial personality disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, depression. And ultimately, I predict he'll die in early death. Not necessarily through the death penalty, perhaps, that'll be your decision, but because of his unhealthy lifestyle and the risk factors, he's going to develop not only psychological problems, but physical problems, and on average, this person will die at a younger age than the person who did not experience these.
All right. Excuse me, counsel. Please approach. Excuse me. All right, ladies and gentlemen, this is all the testimony that you're going to hear today. I need you here tomorrow morning, again before 9 a.m., and again, I need you to bring your suitcases with you. Also, okay, the admonitions still apply. You're not to discuss this case with anyone. You're not to obtain or seek any information outside this courtroom. The best way to guarantee that the parties do not have a fair trial is for you to obtain information outside this courtroom, and then obviously allow that information to influence you in your deliberations. So please, everyone, have a safe trip home tonight, a safe trip back tomorrow morning. See you here before 9. We'll get started as close to that time as we can. And again, don't forget your suitcases. Or I guess you could leave them here if you want to. We can figure that out as well. Check with them. All rise for the jury. See everyone at 9 o'clock tomorrow. Counsel, I'll provide you a single copy of the revised jury instructions that we've discussed. You have a chance to take a look at it tonight. Correct. Exactly. Yep.